Imagine a city that floats. A city where the streets are made of water, where the fog rolls in so thick at night that you cannot see your own hand in front of your face. A city where behind every golden mask, behind every velvet curtain, behind every quietly closing door, a secret is being kept. That city is Venice. And the century we are about to enter is the 1700s, a time when this ancient republic was at the height of its mystery, its beauty, and its slow, silent collapse. What you are about to hear is not just history. It is a story whispered through the centuries, carried on the tide of the lagoon, waiting for someone to finally listen. Venice in the 18th century was unlike any other place on earth. While the rest of Europe was marching toward revolution, while kings were losing their heads and empires were cracking at the seams, Venice held on, not through military power, not through industrial strength, but through something far more subtle, far more ancient, and far more dangerous, the art of secrecy. The Republic of Venice, known to its own citizens as La Serenissima, the most serene republic, was already more than 1,000 years old when the 1700s began. 1,000 years of survival, 1,000 years of secrets. And by the time the century opened its eyes, those secrets had built themselves so deep into the stone and water of the city that even the stones seemed to know things they would never say. To understand Venice in the 1700s, you must first understand what Venice was and what it was pretending to be. On the surface, it was a paradise. Visitors from across Europe, artists, diplomats, merchants, philosophers, the curious, the scandalous, and the desperate poured into the city every year, dazzled by what they found. The Grand Canal gleamed in the morning light like liquid silk. The palaces that lined its banks, the Ca' d'Oro, the Palazzo Pisani, the magnificent Palazzo Ducali itself, rose from the water like something out of a dream. There were theaters on every corner. There was music pouring from open windows. There were gondolas drifting silently through narrow canals while their passengers laughed and drank and pretended that time did not exist. Venice, to the outside world, was a carnival that never ended. And that was entirely by design. Because behind the carnival, behind the laughter, behind the gold, and the glass and the glittering masks, Venice was a surveillance state of extraordinary sophistication. The Council of Ten, the city's most powerful governing body, had been watching its citizens since the year 1310. By the 1700s, they had perfected the craft. Informants were everywhere. Not paid, professional spies, though those existed too, but ordinary citizens, shopkeepers, gondoliers, priests, even children, who passed their observations through a network so finely woven that it was nearly invisible. Throughout the city, built into the walls of churches and public buildings, were slots carved from stone in the shape of a lion's open mouth. They were called the Bec di Lion, the mouths of the lion, and into these stone mouths anyone could slip a letter, a denunciation, a name, an accusation, anonymous, untraceable, permanent. Lean in close for a moment and think about what that means. You are walking through Venice in the year 1730. You are a merchant, or a nobleman, or a visiting diplomat. You say something at dinner, perhaps a criticism of the Doge, perhaps a rumor about a senator, perhaps nothing more than the wrong joke at the wrong moment. By morning, that comment could be folded into a piece of paper and dropped into a lion's mouth. And within days, you could find yourself summoned before the Council of Ten, or worse, before the even more feared body known as the State Inquisitors. No trial as the modern world would recognize it. No open courtroom, no right to confront your accuser. Just questions, silence, a decision made behind closed doors. And whatever that decision was, you would learn it alone, in the dark, without warning. This was the shadow beneath the carnival. This was the secret Venice kept from its glittering surface. The streets of Venice, the calle, the narrow alleyways barely wide enough for two people to pass, were laboratories of human behavior in the 1700s. Unlike the broad boulevards of Paris or the organized squares of London, Venice's layout was intentionally disorienting. The city had no plan, no grid, no logical progression from one point to another. It had evolved organically over centuries, built on more than 100 small islands, connected by bridges that arched over dark water, winding through neighborhoods that seemed to shift and rearrange themselves in the fog. Even long-time residents could get lost. And that was, in many ways, the point. A city where it was easy to lose yourself was also a city where it was easy to disappear. The neighborhoods themselves each carried their own character and their own secrets. The Rialto, the commercial heart of the city, was where money moved, and where money moved, information moved with it. Merchants from the Ottoman Empire, from Germany, from the Jewish ghetto nearby, from England and France and Spain, all converged on the Rialto Bridge and the market beneath it. The coffee houses that dotted the nearby streets, the Bottega del Caffè, were among the most politically charged spaces in all of Europe. Men gathered there not just to drink the dark, bitter liquid that had arrived from the east and swept across the continent, but to talk, to argue, to scheme, to share the kind of information that would never be written down. The walls of a Venetian coffee house heard more history being made than any palace chamber, and they kept every word to themselves. The Jewish ghetto of Venice deserves its own moment of attention because it holds within its story one of the most complex and heartbreaking secrets of the city. The word ghetto itself comes from Venice, from the Venetian word ghetto, the name of the area where a copper foundry once stood. In 1516, the Republic of Venice had forced the city's Jewish population into this confined area on the island of Cannaregio, locking the gates at night, controlling movement in and out during the day. By the 1700s, the ghetto had existed for nearly 2 centuries. And yet, within its crowded, stacked buildings that grew taller and taller because they could not spread outward, a community had built something extraordinary. Schools, synagogues, libraries, trading networks that stretched across the Mediterranean. A community that had survived by adapting, by being essential, by being too valuable to destroy, and too different to fully accept. The Jews of Venice's ghetto walked a line that was razor thin every single day, navigating a world that needed them and feared them in equal measure. And they did it in the shadows, because the shadows were the only place they had been given. Now let us walk deeper into those shadowed streets. Let us follow the light of a lantern carried by a figure in a black cloak, moving through the Calais at midnight in the year 1755. Step into a world shrouded in mystery, a city where everyone is a stranger and every face is a lie. Welcome to 18th century Venice, the notorious capital of disguise. By the 1700s, the famed Venetian carnival wasn't just a party. It was a season of collective pretending that stretched for months. From the day after Christmas all the way to Lent, wearing a mask wasn't just allowed, it was often mandatory. Imagine an entire city hidden behind the same disguise, the botta. This was a stark white mask with a jutting chin, designed so you could eat and drink without ever revealing your face. Topped with a 3-cornered hat and a black cloak, a nobleman became indistinguishable from a fisherman. A senator could stand shoulder to shoulder with a servant, neither knowing the other's station. For women, it was a taste of unimaginable freedom, a chance to walk the city streets alone, unchaperoned. The mask was the great equalizer, but it was also the great deceiver. And this culture of concealment didn't end with carnival. By the 1700s, masks were worn for much of the year, especially when it came to Venice's greatest passion, gambling. The Ridotto, opened in 1638, was Europe's most famous gambling house, and inside, masks were acquired. Night after night, fortunes were won and lost. Ancient noble families could be bankrupted in a single evening. Because everyone was masked, all the usual social cues vanished. You couldn't read a face for a bluff. You couldn't tell if the man across the table was a prince or a pauper. You were playing against a mask, not a man. And through it all, the Venetian state, which operated the Ridotto, silently collected its share from every game, every hand, every ruin. Let me tell you about a young nobleman. We'll call him Marco. In the autumn of 1741, he walked into the Ridotto, hidden behind his botta, carrying the last of his family's fortune. His father had gambled it away, and his grandfather before him. It was a ruinous family tradition. Marco played through the night. As the candles burned low, he found himself surrounded by silent, masked figures, and he realized he had lost everything. He stepped out into the gray morning light, crossed a bridge, and stared into the dark water of the canal. That image a masked, ruined man staring into the water of a city that was itself slowly sinking was a story Venice told its citizens over and over. The beauty was real, but so was the peril just beneath the surface. The mask made it impossible to know the difference until it was too late. There was one group of people who saw through the facade, the gondoliers. They were invisible, not like spies, but like servants so essential that they were never truly seen. As they pulled their passengers through the city's watery veins, under low bridges and through impossibly narrow passages, their passengers talked. They confessed love affairs, financial disasters, political schemes, and bitter family feuds. They spoke of things they dared not say within walls that had ears. And the gondoliers heard it all. It was an open secret that some of them reported what they heard to the Council of Ten, the Republic's feared state security. But which ones? No one knew. Every quiet ride through the dark canals could be an interrogation. And yet, paradoxically, these same gondoliers were among the most trusted people in Venice, entrusted with secrets, bodies, and the safe passage of those who could not afford to be seen. But the most famous resident of Venice's shadowed world wasn't a noble or a merchant. He was a man who built his life on secrets, seduction, and sheer survival. His name was Giacomo Casanova. History remembers him as a legendary lover, but the real Casanova was far more complex. Born in 1725, the son of an actress and an unacknowledged nobleman, he grew up on the fringes of society, close enough to power to understand its language, but never truly a part of it. He studied law, dabbled in theology, played the violin, and worked as a secretary, all the while moving through every level of Venetian life, learning its codes and vulnerabilities. Casanova was, above all, a master observer. He watched how power worked, how information moved, and how powerful men revealed their weaknesses in moments of pride or pleasure. He collected this knowledge like an archivist. By his 20s, he had woven a vast network of contacts, nobles, clergy, artists, merchants that functioned just like a modern intelligence network. He became a man who knew too much. And in 1755, the Council of Ten came for him. The official charges were vague: practicing magic, which really meant manipulating powerful men through psychological tricks, and libertinism, spreading ideas that threatened the social order. But most historians agree the real reason was simpler. Casanova had moved too freely and heard too many secrets. A republic built on secrets couldn't afford to have a man like him walking its streets. He was arrested at dawn and taken to the infamous prison known as the Leeds Abbey, located directly under the lead roof of the Doge's palace. The Leeds were legendary across Europe as a place from which no one escaped, not because of extraordinary physical security, but because of the psychological weight. Trapped at the very heart of the power that imprisoned you, with no trial, no lawyer, and no contact with the outside world, most men simply gave up. They waited, they grew smaller, and they accepted their fate. But Casanova was not most men. His story, and the story of Venice itself, is a testament to the idea that even in a world of masks and secrets, the human spirit fights for freedom. Thank you for watching. If you were captivated by the shadowed history of Venice, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell for more stories from the past. See you next time. Casanova did not accept his fate. Over the course of more than a year, working with a fellow prisoner, using tools he had concealed from his guards, Casanova dug, planned, and executed one of the most audacious prison escapes in European history. On the night of October 31st, 1756, All Saints' Eve, as if the drama demanded it, he broke through the lead roof, crossed the palace in darkness, descended through the palace's ceremonial chambers, and emerged into the pre-dawn streets of Venice as a free man. He hired a gondolier, crossed the lagoon, and by morning was outside the Republic's jurisdiction entirely. He would spend the next 18 years wandering Europe, Paris, London, Vienna, Madrid, St. Petersburg, a Venetian exile carrying Venice's secrets wherever he went. The escape of Casanova was not just a personal adventure story. It was a crack in the armor of the most serene republic. The Leeds were supposed to be inescapable. The Council of Ten was supposed to be infallible. The surveillance state that Venice had built over centuries was supposed to have no gaps, no failures, no moments of human vulnerability. And yet a man with a nail, a determination and a willingness to believe in his own survival, had walked through all of it as though it were made of paper. The story spread across Europe. People who had feared Venice, ambassadors, merchants, visiting nobles who had sat nervously through dinner parties, wondering whether a misplaced word would end their career, heard about the escape and felt something they had not expected to feel about Venice. Something like relief. Something like a secret joy. But let us not follow Casanova out of Venice. Let us stay. Let us stay in the city he left behind and walk its streets a little longer, because the secrets of Venice, as shadowed streets in the 1700s, go deeper than any one man has story. The women of 18th century Venice lived lives of extraordinary complexity. On the surface, they were constrained by the same systems of patriarchal control that governed women across Europe, confined to the home, expected to marry young to manage households, to produce heirs, and to disappear into the background of public life. Venetian noblewomen were in some ways even more restricted than their counterparts elsewhere, because the Republic's as rigid class hierarchy meant that a noblewoman who married beneath her station could cause serious damage to her family's political standing. Many noblewomen, as a result, were not permitted to marry at all. They were placed in convents from childhood, not necessarily out of religious calling, but as a calculated decision by their families to preserve wealth and status. The convents of Venice in the 1700s were, consequently, among the most extraordinary institutions in all of Europe. They were not places of silence and withdrawal. They were social hubs. They held salons. They received visitors. Their residents, educated and accomplished women who had been deposited there by families that had no other use for them, became poets, musicians, artists, and, whisper it, political operators. Correspondence flowed in and out of Venetian convents with a freedom that would have astonished anyone who imagined them as places of holy isolation. Affairs were conducted, in some cases, through the iron grills that separated nuns from visitors. Information passed. Influence moved. The women behind those grills knew things, and they shared what they knew with those they trusted. And what they trusted most was silence. One of these women, a nun at a convent on the island of Murano, became the great love, or the great obsession, or perhaps both, of Casanova himself before his arrest. He refers to her in his memoirs simply as Emma, and historians have never definitively identified her. She was, by his account, extraordinarily intelligent, politically connected, and entirely aware of the danger of their relationship. She was also, apparently, the mistress of the French ambassador to Venice, a man whose presence in Venice placed him at the very center of the city's diplomatic web. A man moved between these worlds with a fluency that should have been impossible, between the convent and the casino, between the ambassador's bed and her prayer book, between the role Venice had assigned her and the life she had somehow built within its constraints. She was, in every sense, a Venetian secret. And like most Venetian secrets, she eventually dissolved back into the silence from which she had briefly emerged, leaving only the traces that Casanova preserved in ink. The physical city itself was keeping secrets in the 1700s that its inhabitants could feel, but not quite name. Venice was sinking. It had always been sinking. The islands on which it sat were built on wooden piles driven into the mud of the lagoon, and over centuries those piles compressed the sediment beneath them, causing the city to settle, gradually and imperceptibly, closer to the water's surface. In the 1700s, this process had been going on for centuries, and while no one in Venice had the scientific framework to fully understand what was happening, everyone could feel it. The acqua alta, the high water that flooded the city's lowest points, came more frequently and reached higher than it had before. Churches that had once stood clear of the tides now found seawater lapping at their foundations. The mosaic floors of St. Mark's Basilica had developed waves and undulations as the ground beneath them shifted and settled. The city was very slowly returning to the lagoon from which it had been built. And the Venetians, with the pragmatism of a people who had always lived with water, adapted. They raised doorsteps. They built elevated walkways. They continued their carnival, continued their gambling, continued their surveillance and their secrets, with the tide rising around their boots. There is a melancholy to this that the 18th century felt without fully articulating. Venice in the 1700s was a city aware, at some level, of its own ending, not the dramatic ending of conquest or revolution, but the slow, dignified ending of a thing that had outlasted its purpose. The Republic had been built on trade. For 1,000 years, Venice had sat at the crossroads of East and West, controlling the flow of spices, silk, glass, salt, and ideas between the Mediterranean world and the rest of Europe. But by the 1700s, those trade routes had shifted. The great maritime powers were now Spain, Portugal, England, and the Netherlands, nations with Atlantic coastlines, with access to the Americas, with trade networks that made the old Mediterranean routes look small. Venice still traded, still produced the finest glass in the world at the furnaces of Murano, still maintained its famous arsenal, the great shipbuilding facility that had once been capable of producing a fully armed warship in a single day, but the economic foundation of Venetian power was crumbling as quietly and as certainly as the city as physical foundations. The patrician families of Venice, the 100 or so noble houses whose names were inscribed in the Golden Book, the official register of Venetian nobility, felt this decline most acutely. Wealth that had accumulated over generations was dissipating. The gambling houses consumed what trade no longer produced. Younger sons with no prospects and no trades roamed the Cali in masks, looking for amusement or trouble or both. The gap between the splendor of Venice's public face, its festivals, its palaces, its art, and the private reality of its leading families grew wider with every decade that passed. This, too, was a secret the city kept, because keeping up appearances was itself a Venetian art form, perfected over centuries of diplomatic performance. The artisans and working people of Venice, the glassblowers of Murano, the lace-makers of Murano, the fishermen of the lagoon, the boat-builders of the arsenal, lived lives that the grand narrative of Venetian history has always pushed into the background. But they, too, were part of the city's secret life, and their secrets were the most essential of all. The glassblowers of Murano, for instance, were among the most carefully controlled craftsmen in the history of European industry. The techniques they used to produce Venetian glass, the millefiori, the filigree, the cristallo that was so clear and thin it seemed made of frozen air, were among the most valuable trade secrets in the world. The Republic of Venice had recognized this centuries before the 1700s. Murano's glassblowers were given extraordinary privileges. They could marry into noble families. They held a status far above other craftsmen, and their children could be educated alongside the children of senators. But they were also, in a very real sense, prisoners. A glassblower who left Venice, who took his knowledge to another state, to Bohemia or France or England, faced the possibility of assassination. The Republic's agents were reportedly authorized to kill craftsmen who tried to export the secrets of Venetian glass. The golden cage was comfortable, but it was still a cage, and the knowledge inside it was worth more than gold. Walk with me now into the final decade of the 18th century. The year is 1789. The news from France is arriving in Venice the way all news arrived, by letter, by courier, by ship, by whispered conversation in coffeehouses. The French king has been deposed. The streets of Paris are running with blood. The old order is burning. And Venice, La Serenissima, the 1,000-year republic, is watching it all with the careful, unreadable expression of a city that has survived everything. The Council of 10 meets. The state inquisitors confer. The Bac de Leon receive their letters. The gondoliers pole their craft through the dark water. The masks are in place. The carnival continues, but something has changed. Something in the air over the lagoon has shifted. The ideas that are tearing France apart, liberty, equality, the sovereignty of the people, are spreading like water finding cracks in stone. Venice had always prided itself on its republican heritage, on being a republic while the rest of Europe was ruled by kings. But the Venetian Republic was a republic of aristocrats, not of citizens. Power in Venice had always belonged to the families in the Golden Book, to the 100 noble houses, to the council, of 10 to the Senate, to the Doge himself, a figurehead of extraordinary ceremonial splendor and almost no actual power. The ordinary people of Venice, the craftsmen, the fishermen, the servants, the workers of the arsenal, had no voice in this republic. They had never had a voice. And now, from across the Alps, came a story of a people who had found their voice with the guillotine, and the sound of it was disturbing the perpetual Venetian dream. The man who would end the dream came not from within Venice, but from a young, brilliant, terrifyingly ambitious general from Corsica, Napoleon Bonaparte. In 1796, Napoleon's armies swept through northern Italy with a speed and violence that stunned the old powers. City after city fell. The Habsburgs retreated. The old map of Italy was being redrawn in real time, not by diplomats negotiating over tables, but by artillery and infantry moving across terrain that had seemed, for centuries, to belong to history rather than to the present. Venice watched, and the Council of Ten deliberated, and the Doge made careful, diplomatic, non-committal statements, because neutrality was what Venice had survived on for centuries, and perhaps it would work again. It did not work again. On the 12th of May 1797, under pressure from Napoleon and facing the impossible reality of French military power outside its gates, the Great Council of Venice, the body of Venetian noblemen that had governed the Republic for 1,000 years, voted to dissolve itself. The last Doge, Ludovico Manin, was present in the chamber. When the vote was announced, the vote that ended the Republic of Venice, he removed his ducal cap, the corno, the symbol of his office, and handed it to his servant. He said, reportedly, that he would not be needing it again. The servant took the cap, the Doge sat, the Great Council dispersed, and the most serene republic, which had survived plague, war, fire, earthquake, the shifting of trade routes, the rise and fall of empires, the pressure of 1,000 years of history, simply stopped, not with a battle, not with a siege, with a vote, with a man handing a hat to a servant and sitting down. Napoleon's forces entered Venice on the 15th of May, 1797. French soldiers walked through the same calle that the Council of Ten agents had watched for 5 centuries. They entered the Palazzo Ducale. They opened the archives. They found the records, the denunciations, the interrogations, the secret decisions, the names and fates of thousands of people whose lives had been decided behind closed doors over hundreds of years. The mouths of the lion were examined. Some were sealed. The Ridotto was eventually closed. The carnival was suppressed. The masks came off. What Napoleon's soldiers found in those archives was exactly what you might expect from a city that had perfected the art of institutional memory over 1,000 years. Everything. Every secret was written down. Every decision was recorded. Every denunciation was preserved. The Venetian state had kept records with the obsessive thoroughness of a bureaucracy that believed it would last forever. And so when it ended, the evidence of everything it had done was there, neatly organized, waiting to be read. The surveillance state had surveilled itself out of existence, leaving behind a perfect record of its own nature. But here is the thing about secrets. They do not end when they are revealed. They transform. The secrets of Venice as shadowed streets in the 1700s did not die when Napoleon's soldiers opened those archives. They moved. They dispersed. They sank into the water and the stone of the city and became part of something that does not quite have a name, the particular atmosphere, the particular quality of darkness and light and mystery that Venice carries to this day. Every visitor who has ever walked across the Rialto Bridge at dusk and felt, without knowing why, that they are being watched, they are feeling it. The echo of the mouths of the lion, still open in their stone walls, still asking for names. The glass of Murano still carries in every bubble and swirl the knowledge of craftsmen who are never allowed to leave. The canals still move at their own pace, indifferent to the people reflected in their surfaces. The buildings still lean toward the water, as though drawn by some ancient obligation. And beneath the water, beneath the foundations of every palace, every church, every bridge, the wooden piles that have held the city up for more than 1,000 years are still there, slowly, invisibly, imperceptibly, doing the work of keeping a city of secrets above the surface of the world. There is a lesson in Venice's shadowed streets, and it is not a comfortable one. Venice survived for 1,000 years by trading in information, by knowing more than its enemies, by recording everything, by maintaining a system of surveillance so comprehensive that it became, in many ways, the city's greatest achievement. And yet the very perfection of that system was what made it brittle. A state built on secrets can only function as long as the secrets hold. The moment the secrets become known, the moment Casanova walks out of the leads, the moment Napoleon opens the archives, the moment the mask comes off, the power dissolves. Because power built on mystery cannot survive revelation. It needs the shadow. It needs the fog over the canal. It needs the anonymous letter in the lion's mouth. The day you can see it clearly is the day it is already gone. We live in a world that has built its own mouths of the lion. Our surveillance systems are more sophisticated than anything the Council of Ten could have imagined. Invisible, instant, global, recording not just what we say, but what we search, what we buy, what we look at, how long we look at it, where we go, who we talk to, and when we sleep. We have traded our masks for screens, our gondoliers for algorithms, our anonymous letters for digital footprints that will outlast anything carved in stone. And like Venice in the 1700s, we move through this system with a kind of collective understanding that it exists, that it watches, that it knows, and we continue with our carnival because the alternative is too strange to consider. Venice still floats, still sinks imperceptibly, year by year, decade by decade, into the lagoon that made it and is slowly reclaiming it. The Acqua Alta still floods St. Mark's Square. The gondoliers still move through the dark water, keeping their silence, carrying their passengers, hearing everything. The palaces are museums now, or hotels, or slowly emptying as the permanent population of Venice grew into 100,000 at the Republic's peak to fewer than 50,000 today. The city that was once a living, breathing organism of 100,000 secrets has become, in some sense, a beautiful shell, a museum exhibit of what a city can be when it organizes itself around the management of knowledge and the performance of mystery. But on winter nights, when the tourists have gone home and the fog comes in from the lagoon and the gas lamps make halos in the mist over the narrow calle, and you are walking alone through the maze of streets that have no logic, following the sound of water that could be anywhere, ahead of you, behind you, below you, on those nights, Venice is still exactly what it was in 1730, in 1755, in 1797. A city that knows something. A city that will never quite tell you what it knows. A city that looks at you from behind a mask that it has no intention of removing. The secrets of Venice's shadowed streets did not belong only to Venice. They belong to everyone who has ever understood that power lives in what is hidden, that beauty can be a cover story, that the most effective cage is the one that looks like a palace, and that every empire, every system, every republic that has ever built itself on the management of truth has in the end been undone, not by its enemies, but by the weight of everything it chose not to say. The mouth of the lion is still open. The question is what you would put inside it, and whether you are certain, absolutely certain, that no one is watching you do it.